Welcome back to Documents from Colonial Mexico and the Ayer Indigenous Studies collection. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Leah Markey, the Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library, and I'm grateful to Lisa Voigt at the Ohio State University for taking on the task of moderating today's first session. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Leah, and welcome everyone to the second day of this wonderful conference. I know I speak on behalf of all former fellows when I say that it's a pleasure to gather virtually, which we can do more easily now, although we all very much look forward to gathering in person at the Newberry again. Today, for the sake of time, I won't introduce the individual speakers. There's a link to all of their bios, and we will save questions until the end. Please put your questions in the chat, and we may not have time to get to all of them, but we will address as many as we can. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Michael Schreffler of the University of Notre Dame for the first talk on Alonso de Molina, Aqui, comienza, vocabulario en lengua castellana y mexicana, 1555. Thanks, Michael.
Lisa, and thanks, Leah. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, great. Good morning. This is the title page to Vocabulario en la lengua castellana y mexicana, which was the first printed grammar and dictionary of Nahuatl. It was issued in 1555 from the print shop of Juan Pablos in Mexico City. And the text at the top of the page names the author, Father Alonso de Molina. The image of Saint Francis receiving the stigmata stresses his role as a Franciscan friar. Molina's vocabulario is a unidirectional bilingual dictionary. The entries are organized alphabetically in Spanish, followed by the equivalent word or words in Nahuatl. An expanded and bidirectional edition was published in 2 volumes, in Mexico City in 1571, and the Ayer collection holds those as well. Here are the title pages to the 1571 dictionaries, Spanish to Nahuatl and Nahuatl to Spanish. Molina was uniquely well suited to compile this dictionary in 1555. He traveled to the Americas with his parents at a very young age, and as a child in a bilingual world, he became a fluent speaker of Nahuatl early in his life. By 1523 or 1524, Pedro de Gante engaged him as a translator. He began to study under the friars, and at the age of 18, he was ordained. As a friar, he would eventually live in the Franciscan conventos of Texcoco, Tecamachalco, Mexico City, and Tlatelolco, where he worked with Sahagún. And Sahagún's writings, too, are well represented in the Ayer collection. Molina believed this kind of dictionary to be crucial to the work of evangelization in New Spain. And as he writes in the prologue, and here I'm quoting him, "The lack of the Nahuatl language impedes our improvement of these natives as much in the temporal as in the spiritual." I chose this work from the Ayer collection for the symposium because it documents pre-modern Indigenous American voices quite literally in the form of language. Molina was a Spaniard, but his facility with Nahuatl was formed through years of interaction with native speakers of the language. And as one might expect, The dictionary is rich in the language of sin, sacraments, and salvation, but it also includes other classes of terminology that he only could have gained through communication with native speakers. And an example of this is the theme that brought me to this, his lexicon of architectural terms. Here, for example, are the terms used to describe several kinds of columns. So he has columns of stone and wood, and ones that are round and ones that are square. The translation of these terms demonstrates what James Lockhart called stage 1 of post-contact Nahuatl. That is, words in Spanish are rendered in neologisms based on visual perception and direct experience. So, for example, one of the terms for column incorporates the word for stone and a word for things that are rolled or rolled up. He also provides terminology for the base of the column and the capital of the column. These terms and others in the dictionary present Nahuatl words for the basic forms of the classical orders, which were highlighted in the architectural treatises that were important in the construction of conventos in 16th century New Spain. Among them is this one, Medidas del Romano, measurements after the Roman, by Diego de Sagredo. The title page to this edition of 1541 presents bases, columns, and capitals as the primary elements of what he calls Romano, the set of forms characteristic of edificios antiguos. Sagredo's treatise, like others printed in this period, insists on the importance of geometry and drawing skills to architectural design and construction. And terms related to those subjects also appear in Molina. So here, for example, the triangle is the figure that has 3 angles, and the figure of 3 angles is presented as a word or 2 words in Nahuatl. My working hypothesis is that Molina compiled this terminology through contact with Nahuatls involved in the construction of conventos in 16th century New Spain that used columns with capitals and bases and other architectural forms like arches and vaults, which are also glossed in the dictionary. Evidence for this comes in the form of the conventos themselves, where these forms appear in patios and church facades built by Nahuatls in the 16th century. This photo, for instance, is from the Franciscan convento of Tecamachalco in Puebla, where the patio is framed with arches supported on columns with bases and capitals. This hypothesis is also supported by additions to Molina's lexicon of architecture in the 1571 expanded edition, which includes, for instance, more varieties of columns. So he adds like the ocavada here and a term for columns used in clerestory windows. These changes presumably came from the experience of building. In a sense, then, it's worth reconsidering the issue of authorship for the 1555 and 1571 editions of the vocabulario, taking into account the acts of communication that informed the architectural lexicon. That is to say, the compilation of this terminology must have been a collaborative project, and Molina's role in it might reasonably be seen as akin to Sahagún's role in the production of his Historia General, which also occurred in the context of Franciscan evangelization and education in New Spain. At the same time, the rendering of architectural terms in Nahuatl that we see in the vocabulario conjures the image of an architectural counter-treatise in which forms like columns with bases and capitals are detached from their ancient and Roman associations and take on new life for speakers of Nahuatl in New Spain. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to get into the documents themselves after yesterday's wonderful overview of the past, present, and future of the collection. So we'll go on to another instance of that with Claudia Brittenham of the University of Chicago speaking on the will of, oh, I'm sorry, I misread my notes here. We're having Catalina Ospina next, also from the University of Chicago, speaking on the will of Don Miguel Damián, with genealogy 1576. Thank you, Catalina.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Leah. I'm very grateful to be here. Let me share the screen. Okay, can you all see it? Okay, so I will be talking to you today about two related manuscripts from central Mexico, produced in the late 16th century. One is in the National Library of France in Paris, and the other one is at the Newberry in the Ayer collection. They appear to be complementary versions of the testament of an individual named Miguel Damián. And although there is no evidence that indigenous people recorded wills or testament before the conquest, the will was a genre with which natives had to grapple in order to fulfill the demands of the colonial system. And they really became part of a diverse corpus of documents produced by indigenous people that juxtaposed native and Spanish cultural levels at various levels. And so as you can see, the formal features of Miguel's wills appear to be clearly unconventional in comparison to the purely alphabetical early modern will, right? Yet they conform to it surprisingly well. So for instance, the Spanish Testament usually began with a religious formula invoking God, after which that the stater stated the date, their name and place of residence, and the intent to make a will. After this, these documents often list money for masses, burial, and charity, and most of these takes place in the first line of the Paris document. At the top left, the name Miguel Damián is written in Spanish. Right below appears a mummy bundle, under which there are 3 rows of coins, which likely are the money that he, had for his burial, to pay for the cost of the burial. And to the right of the bundle is a church building, followed by a series of rectangular shapes that represents diverse types of land. You can see there. Almost all of them have measurements in glyphic Nahuatl, and their location is also signal in glyphic Nahuatl. And they were probably assigned to pay for masses and for charitable contributions to the church, which is something very, very common in alphabetical wills drawn by natives in the period. So after this section, the Spanish wills usually enumerated the rest of the property that should be disposed of, right? And the persons who were meant to receive it. Houses were listed first, then land, and finally movable property. And in the Paris will, we see almost all of this. So in the lines that follow, for the most part, we see the same pattern. The first thing depicted is a person. Then come houses and land, and finally movable property. So these sections really follow the same order in which property was enumerated in Spanish will. So the document not only conforms to this kind of ways of organizing information, but it also conforms to the reading order of a Spanish document, right? From left to right and top to bottom, which is really not necessarily the norm in pictographic documents. Yet, in spite of these correspondences, the Paris document lacks key information about the relationship of the heirs to the testator, and such relations determine rights of inheritance in early modern colonial society. Children born of sacramental marriage had full rights to inherit, whereas children of less formal unions had more limited rights. And usually wives had no claim on the state if the testator had any children. There's a very important feature of the will genre is to make explicit the relationship of the heirs to the testator, which brings us to the Newberry will. This document, although significantly different in format from the Paris document, matches the information contained in it almost exactly. You'll have to take my word for that. But one of the key additions to it is a 2-generation genealogy that displays the relationship of Miguel to his most significant heirs. And this new information is probably what explains the need to draw this other document. As you could probably see from the images, the nature of the quality of the paper is quite different. The Paris will was drawn in European paper, whereas this one at the Ayer collection was made on metal. So let's look further at this. When we look close at the genealogy, seated in front of Miguel, we see Ana, who appears to be his wife, not only because of her position, but also because she's not an heir. Yet she's still shown as an important figure. She's larger than all the others, and she raises her left hand, pointing with her index finger, which is a sign of authority. Their children appeared organized horizontally above their parents, and the lines that connect them to their parents and that connect their parents are solid and highlighted in red. But there's also another line, as you can see there, that which is not highlighted in red and it's dotted, that connects Miguel just to Isabel. So this seems to indicate that her relationship to him, Isabel's, is different. It's of a different kind than the rest of the family, and that she's only related to him, right? Her position, it's also significant in that she sort of like breaks the symmetry of the genealogy. So, I mean, one possibility is that she's a mistress or an illegitimate child. And I think the latter is most likely, even though she's depicted at the same level as Ana. First, the glosses next to Ana and Isabel's figures read 60 years and 1 year, respectively. And second, in the colonial context, although mistresses were tolerated, they had no religious standing nor inheritance rights. Illegitimate children, on the contrary, had limited rights to inheritance. So Isabel's representation in the document seems to acknowledge her illegitimate condition, and which is signaled by her position, the dotted unhighlighted line, but it also presents her as a deserving heir, which is an important distinction to make because in the testament, her share of and the inheritance is similar to that of the other children. So in this brief sketch of this quite complex document, what I hope I was able to make evident is how the actors involved in crafting them adapted pre-Hispanic conventions in order to conform to to Spanish notions of death, forms of ownership, and ways of transmitting property, so as to make them suitable for the colonial legal system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catalina. That was fascinating. Just a reminder to put your questions in the chat. We will have time for them at the end. And with that, we will turn to our last speaker, Claudia Brittenham from the University of Chicago, speaking on the genealogy of Pedronilla and Juliana, 1576. Claudia?
Okay, now I'm not muted. Thank you so much, Lisa and Leah and Rose for organizing this event. And it's such a pleasure to be talking about Indigenous voices in the Ayer collection and to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land in a city that has one of the most vibrant living Indigenous communities today. Okay, I've had to rethink a lot of what I said in light of what Catalina just said. So this is going to be a particularly interesting presentation as we rethink some ideas live. Okay. So the document that I'll be presenting today, this genealogy of Pedronilla Francisca and Juliana Tlaco, is part of a suite of interconnected documents related to a lawsuit about an inheritance and property dispute that took place in the city of Xochimilco, just south of Mexico City, between 1575 and 1576. Unusually, we have actually 5 different documents related to this story, but because of modern collecting practices, they're separated in a lot of different repositories. So the original will of Constantino de San Felipe which occurs both in Nahuatl and in a Spanish translation, is in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City. So that happens in 1572. Then there's a lawsuit in 1575-76, and we see Pedronilla's claims, they're in the Newberry, Juliana's claims, they're in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the genealogy that I'll be focusing on today, which is in the Newberry. And then there's oral testimony by Pedronilla, Juliana, and their supporters, and those textual records remain in the Archivo General de la Nación. But because we have this really, sort of rich suite of interconnected documents, it gives us, we can put together a story about marriage and lineage, inheritance, and Indigenous women's agency. And at the same time, it helps us imagine the kind of context that would have originally accompanied other Nahua pictorial documents, like the wills of Don Miguel Damián that we just saw. Okay, on July 11th, 1572, Constantino de San Felipe made a will from his deathbed. An indigenous man from the barrio of Tepetenchi in the city of Xochimilco, he dictated his will in Nahuatl to the scribe Mateo Zeferino de Arellano. After commending his soul into the hands of God, he made bequests to his beloved wife, Pedronilla, and to his mother, Juliana Tlaco. One of his principal concerns was the cohesion of his family after his death. He took care to mention that his wife, Pedronilla, must continue to live with his mother, and that both together should care for his 5-month-old son, Felipe Constantino. And then he made his bequest. To his mother, Juliana, Constantino left 2 houses, one finished and one a solar that was still por cubrir, or still to be covered and built on, as well as other kinds of wealth, including a wooden bed, a koa or planting stick, and 2 wooden chests, one full of bundles of textiles and the other containing 20 vessels for stirring chocolate and 7 stirring sticks. To his wife, Pedronilla, he left the lands that he owned in an area called Huexocolco and other raised fields in Chalchuhuapan, as well as a cuexcomat, or a large container for storing grain. And then there's a horse that was to be sold to pay for masses for his soul. And so over here, we see the conversion. I think it may be under people's faces, I apologize for that, we see the conversion of the horse into tomines, or Spanish coins, to pay for masses. 3 years later, in the summer of 1575, a dispute between the daughter-in-law and mother-in-law ended up in court. In the interim, the child, Felipe Constantino, had died. We don't know who started the lawsuit, but we have both pictorial and written testimony for both sets of claims. So on the one hand, Pedronilla Francisca, whose last name is sometimes Tewich and sometimes Teuche and sometimes Tenuch, who was Constantino's wife, claimed not only the lands that her husband had left to her in her will, but also all of the goods that Constantino had bequeathed to his mother, as well as one of the houses. Although the other house, she agreed, belonged to Juliana, her mother-in-law. So if you look carefully, you'll see that this says Pedronilla Francisca, esposa mujer de Constantino de San Felipe, and then you can see how these lines connecting that to all of this other property, and we see Pedronilla, she really sort of slathered her name all over this. And right here, though, this one house is still marked as belonging to Juliana. On the other hand, Juliana Tlaco, Constantino's mother, claimed that Constantino did not have the right to give away any of the things that he had because they were her possessions, not his. She claimed to have brought all the property to the marriage, while her deceased husband, Felipe Tlotli, who's represented here by a mummy bundle, had brought nothing. And we can see also down here, their son, Constantino de San Felipe, also deceased, represented with this convention of a mummy bundle, and here the son, Felipe Constantino, also dead. Further, Juliana argued that the lands were inalienably tied to the houses and could not be separated from them. And that's what these solid lines here seem to represent. However, Juliana did concede ownership of the cuexcomat, or grain, the vessel for grain storage, to Pedronilla. Juliana would have been happy to give everything to her grandson upon her death, she testified, but now that he had predeceased her, that arrangement just didn't make sense anymore. the case was eventually decided in favor of Juliana Tlaco, the mother-in-law. Now, it's not entirely clear what role the genealogy played in the lawsuit or who introduced it as evidence. It does use a format that would have been intelligible to both Spanish and Nahua audiences, and I hope is pretty easily understandable for us today as well. It may have been created for another purpose and then later edited to make it more relevant to the slide, to this case. We can see at a minimum that a scribe has added alphabetic names for the principal parties: Pedronilla, Juliana, Constantino de San Felipe, and his son Felipe Constantino, whose shaded faces indicate that they were already dead at the time that this document was entered in as evidence. What this genealogy discloses that is nowhere mentioned in the textual documents is that Pedronilla and her husband, Constantino, were second cousins. That is, they had a common ancestor, the seated man at the bottom of the page, who, judging from the tied cloak or tilma that he's wearing and the mat that he sits upon, must have been a man of some importance, although not nearly as important as Don Miguel Damián, who has a much more elaborate throne with the back, and then is also wearing that Spanish style hat on top of his head. And so we, once again, just as in the will of Don Miguel Damián, we see this marriage to another woman who's shown, a Nahua woman who's shown wearing the huipil long skirt, and then this particular two-horned headdress or hairstyle of Nahua women that's very conventionally used to represent married women. And we see that representing women in successive generations. Well, now, Constantin, and we can see that Pedronilla is a descendant of this principal line. Constantino de San Felipe is the descendant of a second kind of relationship, which I'd originally been tempted to gloss as a relationship of a second marriage. But now, after Catalina's presentation, I find myself wondering whether this is, in fact, an illegitimate child. I also wonder, quite honestly, though, if this is 1576 up here, or 1572, if we're all the way back before the Spanish invasion over here, and we're looking at something like a situation of polygamy that was then changed, where you then had to pick a wife under the once Christianity was brought to New Spain. But whatever the case is, we can see that Constantino is the descendant not of this principal line, but of a second marriage or an illegitimate child. But the reconvergence of these two lineages recalls some of the long-term dynastic marriage strategies that Camilla Townsend has recently talked about in the royal family of Mexico Tenochtitlan, strategies for keeping wealth and power concentrated within particular families and avoiding succession battles. Now, this family in Xochimilco was well off, but nowhere near the heights of the rulers of the Aztec Empire. But I still can't help but wonder whether the history of shared descent helped bolster some of Pedronilla's audacious claims. She was from the main line, while Juliana Tlaco was an outsider who had married into the family, and according to this genealogy at least, a second wife at that. There's so much that's still unclear about this set of documents. No two accord perfectly in all their details, and exactly what the genealogy in particular had to do with the legal claim remains a little bit unclear. But at the very least, they help us see Indigenous women exercising their rights in a court of law in 16th century New Spain. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I absolutely loved that example of what happens when you get scholars who are working on these primary sources together and looking at one another's documents and suggesting new ideas of ways to think about them. That was in terms of your reflection on Catalina's presentation. Really just fascinating papers, fascinating documents. We have some questions rolling in. Let's see, the first question, and I initially thought, because we have quite a few, I think I will, I'll read them for now, but please do raise your hand if there's anything you want to add to the question that you've put in the chat, because we certainly are fine with other people participating in the conversation. So the first question from Edward Polanco is for Michael. And he asks, I was wondering if you have found any attestations of the architectural terms you mentioned being used in other documents. It would be interesting to see if they were created for the colonial contact zone that Molina created, or if they were used in common practice. Michael?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have not looked into this as much as I would like to, but one thing that I can say about the use of the terminology is that it does appear in the Florentine Codex in one place that it occurs, probably in several, but one place that it occurs is in the section about the different kinds of houses and the work that stonemasons do and the work that carpenters do. So those are some places where it appears. Also in other dictionaries. It's not quite the same thing, I don't think, as what you're asking. But the dictionary from the language of Michoacan, which is almost contemporary, with the Molina dictionary, has terminology for some of these, not in Nahuatl, of course. So this is something I'd like to pursue, and your question points to exactly how it should be pursued. I mean, I would also like to know more about the terms in Nahuatl themselves and how to think about them in terms of symbolism. The terminology often relates to materials and colors and, of course, shapes. And I wouldn't trust my own interpretations of those texts. I studied Nahuatl as a grad student in what was an extremely memorable experience at the University of Chicago, but I think this kind of a project would probably be best worked on as a collaboration, is what I'm thinking.
That's great. I love collaborations, and I'm going to force my friends Heather Allen and Laura Matthew to collaborate on their question because they are somewhat overlapping. So I'll articulate them together. These are for Catalina. So one question is, why do you think Doña Isabel has a speech scroll coming out of her mouth in the Ayer will? And for Catalina also, this is from Laura Matthew, how pictorially are Doña Isabel's inheritance rights being asserted, and what is she inheriting? And she wonders, and I think this is actually before she heard Claudia's presentation, said, what could Doña Isabel be a second wife rather than an illegitimate child? So a couple questions about Doña Isabel, and let me know if you need me to repeat those. I know it's a lot of information at once.
Thank you, Laura and Heather. Yes, I mean, they're questions that I've been thinking a lot about, and I go back and forth. So there are a couple things. So why could Isabel be a second wife? She could, but the thing is that Anna is not presented as a deceased person in the Ayer. No, moreover, she doesn't have a speech scroll, but she has her arms out, which I don't know if you maybe saw with Claudia's. That's not that common. Women are usually, they're not showing their arms at all. They're kind of like this, but she is, that's a sign of power and expression. So if they would be like alive at the same time, and if they're claiming rights to if the second wife, I mean, it's a possibility, but that's one thing. The other issue is, I guess, the speech scroll, and I love it. I think the speech scroll is one of the things that highlights the fact that Isabel is the contentious point here. She's the one that's speaking, that seems to be speaking. Actually, and the Newberry document, when, I mean, I'm sad that we don't have it now, but there are some properties that are kind of like shaded in pink, and those are the properties that go to her, and they correspond. And the line in the Paris document, the line says basically the same properties, and so those are not the only properties shaded, but they at least are all kind of like highlighted in a different way that belong to her. So definitely there is a contentious spot over there. And I think yeah, I mean, I think I go back and forth. It could be both things.
Great. Am I, oh, actually, Heather or Laura, do either of you want to jump in with a follow-up? No, Heather's okay. All right. Am I right, Claudia, that there was a speech scroll also in your manuscript?
All over the place. Can I pull up my document again just to show everybody? It is that same kind of pattern where it's really hard to understand who's talking, you know, who has these speech scrolls and why. That this epical ancestor who isn't named makes a lot of sense, but then and we can see that here this is Felipe Tlotli, Juliana, Constantino, Felipe, Pedronilla, but also this woman over here, part of the second generation of the main line, actually has a double speech scroll. Now, one of the things that's actually kind of interesting about this map, and I want to be able to see it in person before I say too much about this, is that, but I hope you can just begin to see that it looks like there are a couple different kinds of ink that are being used on this page. There's this really sort of very firm, very dark, very even black ink. This is an indigenous charcoal-based ink, and it's just gorgeous, you know. And so you see how like this speech scroll is written in that ink, which seems to be part of what's used to make most of the document. But then this speech scroll over here, do you see how it's such a lighter color? And so that's one of the reasons I think. And there are a couple of other things like that. The most notable other one, if you look at how Felipe Constantino, the child's face is shaded, you can see that it's a much lighter tone than some of these other faces here and here. And so that's one of the reasons I think that this document gets intervened on several different times by people using different ink preparations. For what it's worth, but just as in the genealogy that Catalina talked about, it's really not clear what the speech scrolls are doing, other than perhaps indicating particularly important people.
That's fascinating. And is a double speech scroll something that appears elsewhere? Is that a common thing to have a double speech scroll? It's not uncommon. I mean, there's just this huge amount of flexibility in what you can do with a speech scroll. In terms of these sort of genealogies and land claims, I don't know that I can readily come up with another example of one. But if you think about something like the ways that speech scrolls get used in the Florentine Codex or in Mixtec documents, or then back at the city of Teotihuacan, well, before the Spanish invasion, you can elaborate on them in so many different kinds of ways. Alana Radlow-Zur, who might be here today, is writing a dissertation thinking about some of these different kinds of ways of representing intangible things that will give us more definitive answers, at least for the pre-Hispanic periods, pretty soon. Great. And I am going to because Heather raised her hand, and that might be a follow-up on this conversation, but there is another related question. So I think you can even leave the image up for now, Claudia. But Heather, do you want to follow up?
Just my initial thought about the speech scrolls is those may be the people involved most in the lawsuit.
Yeah, I mean, I think Catalina, that works for your will, right?
Yes, but I it works for mine. But yeah, I've seen others where it doesn't. So that's why I'm hesitant to assert that. But yeah.
So I mean, in this genealogy, it's clear that some of the people who have the speech scrolls are long dead, like the apical ancestor down at the bottom. And so that's that would be a really easy, you know, and you know, so you know, Felipe Tlotli is dead by the time the will is written. So are these two figures. So is she probably. So they're being marked in some way, I think, is related to the claim. But then there's also the question in the case of this document about whether this genealogy was created for some other purpose. And a lot of those speech scrolls made sense for that other purpose. And then it got repurposed as part of this land claim later on.
Let me follow up with another question related to this particular document from Guillaume Candela. For you, Claudia, again, how do you understand the absence of Nahua names in these documents and just Spanish names in the genealogy?
This is a great question, Guillaume. Thank you. So one thing I would say is there is one Nahua name on this document right here. And we can't read it because we have no idea, you know, we don't, the textual sources don't give us the genealogy as far back as we have here, but we've got this combination of something like a little down feather and a footprint, and there are various different ways that you might imagine reading that. What we do see in this suite of documents is that the place names continue to be named using Nahua logosyllabic writing. So if I just go back here, we can see Huexocolco, right, with this this sort of curved huexote tree, and then Chalchuquay, oh gosh, what is it? Chalchuquapan, as well, that has this that has these chalchihuit and something about water in it. So we get a kind of persistence of toponymy, but we don't have that same kind of persistence in giving people personal names. And I don't know whether that's just related to practice. I mean, we certainly see in other documents that people are using this really flexible Nahua writing system to render Spanish kinds of names. I wonder if it says something about the fact that this was created already, that in fact, all three of these documents are created already with the Spanish legal system in mind, where rather than being created for primarily Nahua speaking audience. But then why does this guy have his Nahua name? Hard to know.
Thank you, Claudia. And this question, oh, was there a follow-up? Okay. This is also, Heather posed this, and I was interested in this issue too, related to both, really in a sense, all three of your presentations, what you, even though you're focusing on one specific document located at the Newberry, you establish this sort of web of connections with other documents. I wondered if you could answer this, you know, who figured out that these different documents were connected, considering they're at different archives? That was Heather's question. And I would just add on to that, thinking about the presentations we heard yesterday about the formation of archives and collections, and are we witnessing, does that dispersion actually reflect on the violence of archival and collecting practices, the fact that they are you know, documents that are connected that way are located in such you know, distant archives. But the question of who and how we reestablish those connections is something that I'd be curious if you all could address.
Can I go first? Because this lets me do the thing that I meant to do and didn't do, which is I had a final slide, which I will now show you, which has the further resources. So the work of putting all of these together, it's John Glass already in the Census of Nahua Pictorial Manuscripts, who indicates that these documents are all related to each other. But it's really Maria Castañeda de la Paz and Michel Uyek, or however you pronounce his last name, I'm sure he did that wrong, who wrote this article in Revista Española de Antropología Americana that really put the 5 documents together. And then Constantino's will is published in Teresa Rojas Rabiela's Vidas y Bienes Olvidados. So, and I can send all of this to you, Heather, so that you and anyone else who's interested, so that they have these resources. This is in fact a kind of moment of colonial violence, right? You get the sense that there's a legado or something, you know, there's an archive in Xochimilco, and somebody comes through and basically cuts out all pictorial documents because they have more value on the market than anything else. The object in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France comes in associated with both Bobin and Goupil. And I know from Sionade's work that these are both people who are somehow related to the chains where things get sold to Ayer as well. And if Sionade's here and wants to jump in and say even more about that, that would be wonderful. But so yes, absolutely. And you know, I think whenever we see these pictorial documents, you know, they've either belonged to an Indigenous family and somehow have been separated from that family or that community, or they were entered into a legal register as part of a case. And then they've been stolen out of that archive.
Thank you. Claudia, or Catalina, do you want to respond to that question about how you came to connect those 2 documents? Was that long known?
It was. It's actually already something was published in 1975, and partly that's in the handbook of the American Indian. There are a couple articles that talk about this document, and that's why we know the date, because I mean, we saw the what I show you quickly, but they don't have any dates, the documents, both the Newberry and the Ayer document. But there's a third document that names some of Don Damian's descendants, and that's dated, and that's the one that has 1576, and that's why we think you know, they kind of like are from that time. So yeah, and there's, I mean, in the resources that Claudia showed you, there's this website, and there's two. There's one in Mexico, like it's hosted in Mexico, and another one in France that has amazing information of all the groundwork that has been done in a series of this kinds of documents. So that's an incredible source, and I can post those websites for everybody.
It's kind of amazing how those connections can be made. I mean, I assume it's originally by scholars who get familiar with both of those archives, right? There isn't any other way to have traced those connections unless you have that deep familiarity with the collection. Is that, would you say, is that right? Am I, Claudia? Yeah.
It's so, you know, it's amazing to me to think about those first kind of trailblazers who would say, oh, there's a Pedronilla here and there's a Pedronilla there. I wonder if they're the same person.
Right.
And then, you know, and then they're, you know, in this case, there's enough confirmation to recognize that that's the case. I wonder how many other documents out there really belong together, and we just don't have enough cues to put them back together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I just wanted to bring Michael into this conversation, even though we're, you know, print culture and it's very different sort of document. But I was curious about the woodcut on the title page, and if you could say if that was created specifically for that text, or is it possible that it was drawn from another? I'm often looking at those kind of circulations of illustrations.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. I don't know who made it or used it first, but it appears with frequency in 16th century publications. So, you know, I off the top of my head, I can't name them all for you, but it would be possible to catalog them, and probably someone has done that. But yeah, it's I mean, with Franciscan publications in particular, it appears frequently. Oh,
interesting. Okay. I intuited that it was a recycled illustration, I guess. Let's see. There's a question that could be for anyone here from Ralph Cintrón. Does the language of rights, whether applied to inheritance or property, distort the conventions on the ground? Or what about the idea of property? But I guess this is really for Catalina or Claudia. Let me know if you need me to repeat that.
Catalina, do you want to go or shall I go?
Muted. I could give my 5 cents. I mean, I think this is a sticky point. I mean, and then the more that I think about it, the harder it is, because even though I spoke about a colonial legal system, that wasn't really the case. And I think maybe it wasn't as standardized, right? There are many things in flux at this moment, and certain like ways of doing things that collide and get worked one way or another. So perhaps I think that the best way to address this issue is think about more like the term that legal historian Thomas Duff puts forth. It's like histories of normativity. So think about this, or of like an intermingled system of normativity in which these actors are clearly pulling strings from different ways, right? I mean, in my case, we see with the Paris will, it's amazing because they are thinking about an alphabetical document when they're drafting that, right? But they're also, I mean, where is the alphabetical will, or why do it if there is an alphabetical will? right? So they are pulling onto this on the symbolical power of pictography here, right? So all these things, and if that's the case, then also how property rights are being worked. Like, to what aspect of the Spanish sense of property rights are they appealing, and to what aspect of their Nahuatl sense of property rights are they appealing? It's tough, and it's sort of like the next step in my case for taking this research forward.
So I feel like there are greater experts in Nahuatl inheritance systems in the audience than I am myself, and I would invite them all to chime in on this. But there must have been systems for transferring property before the Spanish invasion, right? And and we see reflexes of this both in all of these in these kinds of land cases, and then in vocabulary for different kinds of lands, like Siwatlali, which is this women's land, and whether that's land that's passed through the female line, we don't know exactly. Well, I don't know exactly what these words mean. Maybe somebody else who's here does. So I think Catalina is absolutely right that that we see these indigenous people in the 16th century working at the intersection of two different kinds of systems. And part of where things get really messy is where those two systems don't mesh, right? Where you can have multiple wives in the indigenous system before the Spanish invasion, and then you got to pick one when the Spaniards come. That there's a lot of communally owned land in various different forms before the Spanish invasion, and how that gets translated into a kind of settler colonial notion of land being something that only individuals can own. And so, this language of rights we think of as being something that's very, sort of a very particularly European way of phrasing things. But there are also certainly senses of what is ethical, what is proper, what kinds of responsibilities people have to one another before the Spanish invasion. But we see those through the shadows of these alphabetic discourses.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one or two more questions. I'm going to articulate Tatiana Ceja's question for Catalina, but if anybody else wants to raise their hand, we have just such an incredible group of experts here that I want to be sure that if you'd like to intervene at the end, please do feel free to raise your hand. But this, while you're thinking about that, for Catalina from Tatiana, is the Damian family appears in a lot of documentation at the Notarial Archive in Mexico City. And I'm wondering if you've considered doing a wider family tree to shed light on that document.
Yeah, yes, that's I would love to do that. I just haven't quite had the opportunity yet, but definitely it's something that I look forward to doing.
Great. Anyone else here? Feel free to chime in with your last thoughts or compliments to this really amazing panel. And otherwise, we will, I think, break to. And did any last thoughts from the panelists themselves?
Can I actually ask Michael a question?
Please.
It may be a terribly unfair question, Michael, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how these architectural terms are being formed in Nahuatl, and whether they tell us anything particularly interesting about this project of, once again, thinking about two different kinds of architectural systems that have some kinds of features in common, and then other features that are just completely unfamiliar.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is similar to a question that Virginia Miller asked me, relating to the idea that there were things like columns and pillars before 1555. I mean, it's hard. How would we know until the first time that these words appear in print? And I think, the 1555 dictionary could be the first instance of these words appearing in print. Some of the terms, though, relate to things that I think would have been seen as new, like vault, for instance. And there are others. But this makes me think about, we're talking about genealogy in this panel, it makes me think about the genealogy of forms, really, and thinking about like what's the history of the column or the capital or the base to the Nahuatl speaker, and to Molina, or to people who are looking at Vitruvius and Serlio and Sagredo. So somebody yesterday asked a question about how could the Ayer collection be decolonized, and I don't know the answer to that, but certainly individual objects in the Ayer collection can be interpreted in a kind of a decolonial way that looks at them from a new perspective. And I think this would be one of them, thinking about the history of how to talk about architecture.
I think this is such a wonderful project, Michael. It's really exciting. The other thing that occurs to me is that sometimes, and particularly in the religious documents, like you can spot the neologisms, because they're terrible words. They have the way that all of these different kinds of things get smushed together. And you sort of begin to get a sense that if it's going on for more than 7 syllables, and one of them is plazo, that it is a word that has been invented by some very well-meaning friar, undoubtedly in some sort of consultation with Indigenous speakers. And so I want, as you continue looking at these terms, I wonder whether any of, whether you'll begin to sort of get an intuition that some of these are perfectly good Nahuatl terms before the Spanish invasion, and some of them are really coined thereafter.
Yeah, I would imagine that's probably the case. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for just amazing presentations, giving us a glimpse of your work and the great conversation. Managing these kinds of conversations online is not it's not the easiest and most natural, but I thought it's just a wonderful set of questions, and you're able to engage them, and it allowed all of us to be together in a way that we might not have otherwise been able to do. So I'll let Leah wrap up with final thoughts about when we reconvene in a half hour or so.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to you all for your wonderful papers and for these great comments. So we can all stay on the Zoom and try to, recreate a conference environment. If you want to come out and talk to us, we're here. But we have a good half-hour break now, and we will be doing a tech